We are going to talk about monetizing your impacts and your dependencies. So this 20-minute discussion will be all around euros, dollars, and pounds to explain how big your impact or your dependencies are as a business. So we will have Michael Beutler, Sustainability Operations Director of Kering, one of the luxury brands, soon together with me. He's getting mic'd up right now, so that after that he's able to speak to you. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Martin Lok. I'm Deputy Director at the Natural Capital Coalition. We are a global coalition of more than 300 businesses, governments, NGOs, and other organizations that work together to measure and value impacts and dependencies on natural capital. So Kering is one of our partners. Please, Michael, come on the stage. And I think Kering is one of the champions in this measuring and valuing and monetizing their relation with nature. The first EP&L, environmental profit and loss accounts, goes back to 2011. A couple of years ago, I started to use their EP&L app on my phone, which was quite handy when I had to explain to friends what I'm doing, because it's very practical. And last week they launched even a tool beyond that, an online platform that you are now using to explain all about your environmental profit and loss account, but also gives the opportunity to everyone to look into it, to search it a little bit, and to get behind the figures in your environmental profit and loss account. So before you start, let's check who we have in the room. It's all about impacts and monetization here. Who's new to that field? So maybe just raise your hand. A couple of new people, quite some new people. Who is starting with it but doesn't consider him or herself experienced? A little bit less. And who are the pros that just want to know what they can learn from Kering? Two. Okay, maybe let's come back to that when we are having questions. Michael, I introduced you briefly already, but can you tell us why did Kering start with environmental profit and loss accounts, and how did you do that?
Well, so part of it, we wanted to figure out basically how big our footprint was. And at the same time, how much of a dependency we had on nature, which is a very theoretical kind of idea, especially when you're in the fashion business. Think, well, how does fashion connect to nature? Well, actually, basically, all the raw materials we use to make clothes, whether it's leather, whether it's gold for jewelry, whether it's wool, whether it's cotton, basically comes out of the earth or from the earth. So we have a very, very big dependency on raw materials. And we have a very, very big dependency, I'll say, on the services nature provides. The technical term for that is ecosystem services. So we wanted to understand how much of those services we were consuming and sort of what the impact of what that was, to then figure out, well, how do we reduce that impact? So to do that, we looked at basically all the business processes we had. In the fashion business, you don't really think about how you make stuff. It's really how you sell stuff that matters. It's about the marketing, it's about the designer, it's celebrities, now it's Instagram. I call it the front of the house, but it's the front end of the business. But people didn't really think much about the back end of the business. But now we have, some things happening in the world like scarcity of resources. We have climate change. We have growing demand from consumers. So we basically have to start thinking about these things. And about 8 years ago, we started saying, okay, well, what does this really mean for our business? We started mapping all these things out. What materials do we use? Where are they from? What's the environmental impact of the materials? And then we went a step further. Once we understood the environmental impact, we said, okay, well, what if we put a value to that? Because the big problem in sustainability is we can talk about, a liter of water. We can talk about a few grams or a few kilos of CO2. we can talk about how much waste there is, we can talk about water pollutants, but we can't compare them. There's no way to compare the two. Like, which is better? Is it better to waste a couple liters of water or generate, I don't know, half a ton of CO2? I don't, you know, what's better, what's worth? So what this helped us do is start to evaluate, first of all, what is better and what's worse. So for a given area, if we looked at cotton, we would look at what's the footprint, how much water do we use, how much water pollution is generated, if it's using pesticides, for instance, how much waste happens in the process, how much land use, which is a big impact, how much CO2, both in not only of perhaps in the carbon sequestration value, which may be lost if it's conventional farming, but also we look at how much energy is going into the process. So for all the raw materials, we did that, and for each location where we source them from, which is really, in some cases, all over the world. And then we created a monetary value. And with that monetary value, we came to, and at that point, it was almost 800 million euros we did it in, saying that's, if we were to pay basically nature back for all those resources that we don't pay for, how much would that be? And then we released that publicly.
So this was in 2011, and the 800 million, how was that compared to the profit or the EBITDA in that year?
2011 was Puma, was the first brand we kind of piloted. We released that figure was 2015, and that was about half of EBIT.
Yeah.
So, but investors, I think we did a very good job of coaching our investors before we released it to explain, you know, this is not a financial contingency. This is not some kind of liability. This is just a calculation we're trying to show to understand better our dependency on nature, our linkage to nature. And so that was sort of the beginning of that. And it was very complicated in the beginning. We had even problems on my own team explaining it to each other. So it really was like trying to understand all these different concepts, and there's layers and layers of, sometimes it's not as simple as just, okay, well, where does this water come from? You don't always know that. Sometimes if you're buying it on a spot market, you have to understand the global trade, and there's layers and layers of impacts also, that even when you're looking at an example like cotton, there's machines that you use to harvest it. There's spinning, weaving, dyeing, which is a very energy and water intensive process and pollution creating process to get it to be a fabric that we know and understand. And that's true of all of our raw materials go through various stages of transformation. But what we did then, once we had sort of this way of looking at it, problem was we could present it in PowerPoint and calculate it in a lot of Excel. And that was not very scalable. So then we automated it. And we went through several different stages of automating that to where now we can at least externally sort of let people play with the data. And I think that may be the next slide in the presentation.
Can we get the slides of the presentation, please?
And the next slide after that. So that's the platform. And then this is sort of a drillable platform where it shows our entire footprint of the group. And then if you go to the next slide, you can drill in. You can drill in by, it says filters on the side, it's by environmental impact. You can drill in by our business unit. You can drill in by the tier of the supply chain. This is all online, so this is not, you don't have to capture it necessarily because you can actually go play with it. And you can look at basically any element of our business, what kind of environmental impact we have, and then, well, this is a static way of showing it, but then we show the indicators of how we calculated it, which means actually you could do a similar calculation for a similar business. So we show not only what we call the material intensity. So the material intensity is how much natural resources does it take to create, let's say, take this leather here, 1 kilogram of leather. How much water does it take? How much land use, et cetera, et cetera. That's the material intensity. And then we also show how we value that to take it a step of valuation. So why do we do this? We set a target internally of reducing our footprint by 40%. That basically all of our brands, which now we have, I believe, 14 brands, are accountable to achieving by 2025. So far, we've achieved about a 14% reduction. So this is actually a measurement tool we use to basically guide our business. So I heard, there's been a lot of talk about challenges, and there's all these challenges. Now, there's a lot of solutions out there too. Part of it is you just have to do something. So at that time, there was no such thing as natural capital accounting when we started this. There's no such thing as EP&L. But we had the vision, and I don't take credit for that vision. We had the vision originally of a guy named Jochen Zeitz, and then also the CEO of our entire group who said, let's scale this thing up. And then let's set targets against it. Yeah. And so we created it.
Yeah, Michael, if we look to this slide, so this is just the example for silk production. But what is immediately clear that water consumption, if you look into the impact of silk production, water consumption is the problem. If you look to the overall picture, it's about $500 million impact that you're having based on your last annual sustainability report. The two big proportions there are land use and GHG emissions. So that's what I liked about this tool. You can dive into it and you immediately see what is the big fish there. So can you give an example how this kind of information either guided the discussions at the board for investment decisions or discussions at the designers table when they had to design shoes or bags or whatever they are designing, so to make it even more practical from this level to day-to-day decision taking?
So there's a couple of things. One thing that's key about this is that we discovered that most of our footprint was in the part of the business we knew the least about. So we have what's called a complex supply chain. We have, as I said, our retail, our front end, but the back end of our business is thousands and thousands of partners. It's not our own. We don't have integrated manufacturing. So historically, we didn't really know where things were sourced from. But to do this tool, you need to actually know where it comes from. So we had to do a lot of work in understanding that. And as I said, that was the part of the business that we paid the least attention to. But 66% of our footprint is in what we call Tier 4, which is in the creation of raw materials. Creation is, ranching for wool, leather, farming for cotton, farming for silk, it can be mining. So that's where the raw material creation phase. And then we have additionally another 10% through the transformation, and then through the production phase, you see another 20%. And then finally, the part that we knew the most about in our business, which is our own operation, which is our stores, our warehouses, our building. It's only 10% of our footprint. So first of all, we had a big discovery, where do we need to focus our effort? Second, we set standards for our brands, which we call our caring standards, but it is standards for raw material sourcing. To say, okay, not just you have to reduce it, your target, but here's how. This is what a best practice is. So basically, it's best practices for our brands to implement to achieve savings. So we had to develop those best practices. This basically gave us a roadmap of saying, okay, cashmere. We don't use a lot of it, but it has a huge impact. Why? Because you have lots of cashmere goats eating up all the soil, eating up all the grass, and the soil creates dust storms. Okay, how do we address this? Desertified the Gobi Desert. So how do we address this? So we work on sustainable agriculture. We work on things with farmers that have more rotational grazing. We've seen leather as a huge impact for our group. Something like 30–40% of our impact is in different kinds of leather. So we look at regenerative agriculture. How do we actually use farming as a way to sequester carbon? And we're actually trying to measure what the difference is between the different farming techniques, and then encouraging basically our brands, and through our brands, our suppliers, to support those kind of production methods, not the more destructive ones.
Yeah. Did it also start discussions, for example, with cashmere? If the impact is so big, you also can stop using cashmere, which might be difficult for your kinds of brands. But did you have those kind of discussions?
Well, we did, in that we looked at some materials that maybe, like fur, for instance, we've banned as a group. Mm-hmm. Not so much of the impact, but also for ethical and other reasons. There are some materials or places in the world that we won't source. PVC is another one we stopped using. And plastics, I'll say, one of the things we have to keep in mind if we focus we tend to focus a lot on conventional things. Like, look at leather, it has a big impact. Look in agriculture, look at meat, look at this, look at that. But sometimes, one, you can do things a lot better. Like with farming, there's a big difference between regenerative agriculture and industrial agriculture on many scales. Actually, productivity isn't that much better for industrial agriculture. But in terms of loss, because it takes so much land to create the materials that go into that, to create the feed, to the degree of pollution to have some industrial agriculture. The land isn't regenerated. It actually impacts other things like biodiversity, it impacts soil carbon, impacts a lot of different things. So, one thing is having that understanding that just because it's a new material, plastic is like a very, bioplastic, which can be great, but we don't understand the full impacts. And now we're seeing more and more in the ocean, microfibers coming from the fashion industry. We're seeing that biodegradable plastic does not fully biodegrade. There's still microparticles, which could even be worse. So, sometimes doing the things that are, I'll say, old things better, and sometimes better is going back to traditional ways, is sometimes more sustainable than using the latest and greatest. So that's what the other thing is. Now we have a tool to say, okay, well, is it really better? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
Yeah, and using this tool, you found out that tier 4, so far away on other sides of the globe, usually is where the biggest impact is. How do you deal with the suppliers? Do you make commitments with them on improving their sustainability rates? So that was one of the questions coming from the floor. And how does that work within Caring?
With the suppliers, part of it is, one is the biggest thing you can do is make the market. So we try to match sustainable supply to sustainable demand within our brands. At the same time, sustainable demand means it also has to be something the consumer wants. So at the same quality level, for instance, wool can be done from very good regenerative agriculture, very good agriculture practices. You can get wool that looks just the same as wool that's done in ways that just rip up the land. The wool looks the same, but the process behind it is different. And one of the big things to educate our brands and educate designers is it isn't necessarily a choice between something looking kind of organic-y and the high-end, the high-quality material. It can be high quality. The correlation isn't necessarily that, but it's making sure we have enough supply that can actually meet the demand. Once we use a lot of organic cotton, for instance, we have to make sure that the supply is there. Wool. We've been introducing more and more organic wool. Again, we have to make sure that we're matching supply and demand to help build a market.
And you have to make sure by using these kind of accounting methods that it really is the good option that you're going for. So that's also a thing you stressed. One of the other questions was, great that you're doing all these EP&L, but how about the social impacts?
So we've been looking at social impact on a couple different ways. One thing we're looking at, I'll tell you the funny thing, it's not so funny. On environmental data, it's very difficult to find global environmental data. So you'd say, okay, sure, but social, it must be really easy. Actually, no. There's like 3 major living wage databases out there, and I'll pick living wage because I think that's a key topic in our industry, and I think it's a key social driver. And it's very difficult to find, I'll say, a source of truth that's up to date and reflects real living conditions in any given part of the world. So that's something we've been working on to actually get that kind of data available. So one of the lessons learned we had with the EP&L, we launched into it and then we were looking for data. On the social side, we've been doing things, I'll say, behind the scenes, but now we're really trying to put the data in place before we launch, because we want to make sure that we actually have those metrics. And so we have been looking at how do you take the metrics, because you need a solid foundation of data. How do you really get to a global set of metrics around social conditions? And I'll say the other thing about social is, if you're not focused on those things, human rights and social conditions, personally, I think you're doing a big greenwash. Because then you're saying, oh, well, you know what, environmental impact is bad, but look at all the value we create for society. Well, in my mind, that's your profits. your profits are rewarding you for the value you create. Social side actually is a different way to look at it. One way to look at it is what's all the value we generate. The other is what's the potential we could be generating and how far do we fall short of that.
Okay.
And there are very different ways of measuring that.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think you informed and shared your experiences with the EP&L in a very passionate way. You also told us here that maybe you're most outspoken on the internet with the online website right now on your environmental profit and loss account, but that there's also work coming on the social side, so that's good. Maybe a last thing to give away before we're closing this session. Why should other companies follow in your footstep? What do they have to gain with that? In a couple of words.
Well, first of all, there are actually a lot of companies that have already done similar things that are applicable for their industry. So, and there may be different impacts. Not every industry is going to have the huge impact in the raw material generation. Some may be, if it's more of an energy provider, it may be actually in the, or it could be the consumption of energy, it could be a lot of different things. So I think the reason to do it is fundamental. First of all, you should know how your business works. And I would say a lot of companies don't. And don't in the sense that they don't know what their dependency is on, what their linkage is to nature. And if you don't understand that linkage and you don't measure it, when that changes, and nature is changing before our eyes, your company's in trouble. So it behooves you to establish that linkage. And if you're going to measure, well, first of all, if you're not going to measure it, there's no point in doing it because business people work on measurement. What do they say? You know, you manage what you measure. So whether you do exactly what we're doing or something similar, and I will say a plug, the Natural Capital Protocol is pretty broad-based. It's some pretty basic principles of what to measure, but you're seeing more and more companies that are publishing data. We open sourced our data, and I think it's becoming a lot easier for companies to at least get an overall view, a back of the envelope to begin with, on what their dependency is, what kind of impacts they have, and in a sense, what kind of value, whether it's a positive value, which would be exceptional, or what kind of impact they generate when they value it relative to their value generation on the financial side. It's an opportunity to say, to reflect. So it may have been 50% of our EBIT then. Now, okay, and I won't say it's, we've also had changes in our business mix. We're like a 14 billion euro group. We have an impact of around 500 million if we were to make that equation. What we call our material intensity has dropped a lot. And through that, we've actually had about a 14% improvement over the last 3 years. So there is efficiency and I'll say security that you build into your business, resilience, when you understand that linkage to nature, you measure it, and you act on it.
So I think that the key of your message is if you want to know yourself and your business, and you want to innovate, this is a good way to work on that. So thank you very much for this introduction, this interview, and thank you all for your attention. And I think now it's the end of this session and the beginning of the drinks on the other side of the door. Thank you.